And if unemployment continues to soar, and it's pretty high already in youth and amongst graduates, then the party's got a really big problem of its own, keeping its people on its side from the economic point of view.
And Cindy, on that point, where do you think this goes in terms of politically? I mean, obviously, President Xi is very strong. He's just secured another sort of historic term. There is an authoritarian regime. But what do you think these uprisings and these protests mean for sort of wider discourse in China?
Well, I think in terms of Xi's own security in his position, these protests, had they got to the stage of 1989, had they been more than just a few days of kind of outbursts and marching on the streets, and largely peaceful as well, then Xi may have faced some challenge to his position. But as it stands, by about Monday, the heavy police presence, arresting of certain ringleaders, sending some students back home to their parents early, along with these changes in rhetoric that we've talked about, had already pretty much managed to snuff out what was physically happening on the streets. And digitally, online is very hard in China's kind of monitored social media world to organize anything else. So a lot of young people have gone to Telegram instead, this alternative social media app, which is not monitored, but that requires a VPN, all this sort of stuff. Impact on wider discourse, it's, as Charlie said, it's incredibly hard to say actually how widespread these protests are. And a lot of the videos seem to show a lot of young people, students, as you might expect, or on the other hand, on the other end of things, migrant workers, working class Chinese people who have really had their blue collar jobs disrupted by the last 3 years. But the middle class penetration of this cause, of course, a lot of middle class people are fed up with zero COVID, but are they fed up to that extent? It's not actually clear that the protest cause really penetrated much more widely in the Chinese population.
So you don't think that these protests are part COVID, but speak to a wider dissatisfaction with President Xi and the way things have been run in China? Is that too much of a stretch?
No, I mean, for some people they definitely are. For some people they definitely are. And we saw that in their slogans. Some students went as far as to say "Down with Xi Jinping," "Democracy, not dictators," "Citizens, not slaves," kind of echoing the slogans of a protester in Beijing just before the National Party Congress started. So that was definitely political. But it's very hard to say in a scientific way how widespread that is. There have also been students that said, we actually want to keep this limited to COVID because that means that we can affect more change rather than try to have regime change, which just seems too high or too difficult a goal. So it's very, very hard to say. I'm cautiously optimistic that this is the start of an opening up period, but I don't think that's a foregone conclusion just yet. For the first time in a long time, the Chinese government is talking about opening up in this kind of way. The rhetoric is changing, where you've got the COVID czar talking about how coronavirus is not as scary as previous evidence had said. And then you've also got these easing of certain rules, as you mentioned, Aisha, in terms of self-isolation. But I think until we actually see more real action on broadening vaccine coverage, especially for the vulnerable population, I'm still very cautious to jump to conclusions that this is the beginning of an opening up, because the Chinese government clearly wants to give some kind of carrot in the wake of these protests last weekend. And so are they really going to go further than that? And does that mean they have to swallow their pride when it comes to perhaps importing some vaccines? All of that still remains to be seen.
And Charles, I mean, that's sort of the kind of key dilemma that the Chinese government finds itself in. They've been very hardline in pursuing this zero COVID strategy. They've now had to offer some sort of concessions. But where do they go from here? I mean, if cases go up again, will they have to crack down on people again? Or do you think the Chinese public would just not accept that?
I don't think the Chinese public is unitary. I think there are quite a lot of Chinese public who actually support some of the strict COVID measures because they feel that much more safe with them in place. There's a great fear of COVID within China. And on the other hand, of course, there are many, particularly the young, who are very much against the restrictions. So it's an open sort of page there. But where will they go? I mean, the really big problem is what's going to happen to the economy. What COVID and the protests seem to have done is to erode quite a lot of trust in the party, but the trust is really particularly based on an economic aspiration and things getting better. And if unemployment continues to soar, and it's pretty high already in youth and amongst graduates, then the party's got a really big problem of its own, keeping its people on its side from the economic point of view. And then you've got the COVID side, which may pull it in another direction, because many people aren't vaccinated. If they get ill, if the health service is overwhelmed, too many people die, then that too will be blamed on the party, because the party leads everything. All good things come from the party. All bad things must therefore also come from the party. So that's a real dilemma.
And Cindy, just explain to some of our listeners, because people have known China to be very, very hardline in terms of the COVID restrictions. And yet, and of course, known as an authoritarian regime, and yet the sort of vaccination take-up has not been very high. Or what's happening there? Why is that?
I don't know, Aisha. This is really the $1,000,000 question. I mean, for a country that is capable of digitally surveying its population, is capable of locking people into their flats, I'm not quite sure why vaccines haven't been made mandatory. Part of the reason, short of going mandating vaccines, is that the population, actually, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy there. Partly that comes down to particularly Chinese circumstances, previous scandals where you couldn't trust medicines or food items where they were, really below par and led to a lot of deaths. Part of that's the reason, but there's also, I think, just a lot of, general hesitancy about putting something in your body, which I'm sure some listeners can understand, especially a vaccine that's been developed essentially in a year, as the Chinese vaccine was one of the first to be developed. So I think there's a lot of hesitancy there. And the Chinese government hasn't helped its own cause either, because state media has spent the first 2 years of the pandemic really talking about how scary Western vaccines are, the kind of complications that often come from Pfizer, which, is misinformation at best. And so that means that a lot of Chinese people, they don't want the Chinese vaccine, they don't want the Western vaccine. Given zero COVID, there's very little community infection, so they don't feel the impetus, they don't feel like their freedom is linked to vaccination, because the government hasn't made that link so far. I really I don't personally understand why this is the line that has been drawn. But with nudges, with further policy nudges, with changes in rhetoric, I think more people can be vaccinated, and I think we're starting to see some of that now.
Charles, what do you think is going on with this low take-up of vaccination? Do you agree with Cindy's analysis? Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think Cindy's broadly correct there. I mean, at the end, she in essence made the point that there's been a considerable degree of complacency, because if you've adopted the policy that they have, which in the early days was pretty successful, people didn't get infected, then why bother to get a vaccine, and why push it indeed, when it doesn't seem to be that necessary? Then, of course, Omicron comes along, which is a lot more easily transmitted, and the necessity rises. So we'll see. I mean, I think we'll see a lot more, going well beyond perhaps the word nudge, in the next few months, to get those jabs inside people's arms. And they've reduced the time between the boosters or between vaccinations to 3 from 6 months. So I think we'll probably see a much more rigorous campaign. And of course, when local officials get the message that this is what they might be judged on, your percentage of people that are vaccinated, that too will mean that methods, legal or illegal, or popular or unpopular, probably will be brought to bear on people's arms.
But Aisha, if I may, there still needs to be like a sort of conceptual change as well. Charlie's right. If we can get 100% vaccine coverage based on Chinese vaccines in China, then that will still be some level of deaths. And I think conceptually, a lot of Chinese people need to kind of move on to realizing that living with COVID means having that kind of, I guess that's the cost of it. That's the cost that the rest of the world has paid. And I'm not sure, because of various reasons, because of the complacency from zero COVID, that the government has done enough on kind of managing expectations.
Yes, the expectation management,
that no vaccine is going to be saving all lives.
Absolutely. And as we're seeing from here as well, having a vaccination doesn't mean that you don't get COVID ever again, right, as many of us are finding out. And I suppose the other thing, Charles, is do you think that there has been a shift in the Chinese population with some of these protests because they are seeing what is happening in other parts of the world where life has got back to normal, particularly events like the World Cup that's happening right now? Do you think that's had an influence on sort of public opinion in China?
I'm sure that's had some influence. It's difficult to judge just how widespread the protests is. I mean, these aren't the enormous crowds that, for instance, that you saw in 1989. But clearly the trust is being eroded, and it's the first time there have been protests on one single issue around many parts of China. Usually protests, which occur all the time, are about local issues, and the party's very good at keeping them local. This is the first time when they've spread. So there's clearly a big worry, I would have thought, in the Chinese Communist Party at that prospect. But let's not forget, there's an awful lot of power in the repressive state, much more than there was 33 years ago when the Tiananmen and countrywide protests happened. So they will probably be able to control all this quite well.